Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Johnny Coker. Today, we'll be speaking with a state representative to look back on the work done during New Mexico's legislative session. But first, we'll take a look at some of the current events here in Las Cruces. Since President Donald Trump took office, protests have sprung up across the country, condemning a myriad of the administration's policies. And Las Cruces is no exception. Last week, local activists organized a protest speaking out against the president's immigration crackdown. I was there and have this report. Dozens of protesters lined up outside of the U.S. Border Patrol station on Main Street in Las Cruces to voice their opposition to President Donald Trump's current immigration crackdown. Teresa Valenzuela is with Indivisible Las Cruces, a group of local activists who've organized multiple protests in the city since Trump's inauguration. Valenzuela said the demonstration aims to show support to immigrant communities in the borderland amid ongoing mass deportations.
Any person can have their rights stripped with this current administration. This is a very important project to support and to let the voices of those, the families that are still here and those that have been part of the mass deportation, know that we are not going to let this pass. We are not going to let them be forgotten.
Among the crowd was Bill McCamley, a former secretary for the New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions and former Democratic state representative. McCamley said that it's important for individuals feeling disenfranchised to make their voices heard.
The only way to fix the problem is to get active, get involved, and make your voice heard. And we are so lucky to live in a country where at least still today, we have the right to let other people know what we feel and how to make a change. As an ex-elected official, I can tell you, you are being listened to, so make it count.
When KRWG reached out to U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials requesting a statement, the agency declined to comment. And now joining us to talk about this year's legislative session and other issues facing our state is Sarah Silva, representative for New Mexico's 53rd District. Representative, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And you are a freshman legislator. Can you just give me in your own terms, how did you feel this year's legislative session went as someone just sort of jumping into the whole process?
Right, it was brand new for me, so I didn't have anything to compare it to. But what I did hear from my colleagues was like, oh, we started off much faster than other 60-day sessions. And so for me, that pace felt actually pretty good. But what I heard from others was like, oh, this was a quick start to a 60-day. Like usually it takes some time to build up. So,
And, you know, today I'm going to be asking about, and we're going to be talking a lot about some of the bills that didn't pass this year's legislature or that were ultimately vetoed by the governor. But before we get into that, can you just tell me about some of the bills that you're really happy that passed that will go on to affect the quality of life of New Mexicans that you're proud of, that you are happy were ultimately passed?
Yeah, so one, House Bill 214 was one of the bills that I sponsored along with other colleagues in the House that created a doula credentialing bill for the state of New Mexico. So now New Mexico families who are on Medicaid have access to doula care. And a doula is a non-medical professional that just helps guide the pregnancy and the family through that. And to have people have access to that kind of care, especially in rural parts of the state, is really important. 70% of our babies in New Mexico are born onto Medicaid, and we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. And we know through research that when a doula is present in the community, the maternal mortality improves in that community. And so I was really glad to see that get passed and signed by the governor. And then the other is HB 8, our omnibus crime package. I was really happy to see that pass and for us to reform and update our competency laws so that We can help people who have mental and behavioral health challenges, who are committing crimes, have access to mental health treatment and aren't just being turned back out without services, so that they won't reoffend. And so that's one of the other things that I was really proud that we were able to accomplish. In like the first 3 weeks of the session, we passed a whole omnibus crime package and sent it to the governor for her signature.
Mm-hmm. And public safety was obviously a big point of discussion during this legislative session. And I do want to get back to that, but
Yeah.
I do want to jump into some of the bills that were ultimately vetoed by the governor. Of course, House Bill 143, that lobbyist transparency bill that you were a sponsor of. The governor ultimately vetoed the bill. And now that some time has passed, I just wanted to hear your take. What are your thoughts on the governor's decision?
Yeah, I was really upset that, she, when she first ran for governor in her first term, good governance and transparency was on her platform. That was something she was looking to improve when she first ran. And to see this bill get as far as it has in 15 years, only to be vetoed by the governor, was really disappointing. And again, I think not having good transparency and good governance in the state of New Mexico just impacts all these other laws that we care about that I'm sure we'll talk about, later: public safety, medical malpractice, our education, like all of these bills that so many New Mexicans care about, and we don't know who is behind them and what is influencing the legislation that happens during the session is very problematic, not just for us as legislators, but for the general public. And
like you said, lobbyists do play a big role in the legislative session, along with, the legislative and executive branch. But I wanted to ask about her written statement that she gave after she ultimately vetoed this bill. She said she supports the intent of the legislation, but vetoed it due to some of the language in the bill, including what she called an onerous requirement of lobbyists to file within 48 hours, irrespective of weekends or holidays. I'm sure you saw the full statement. What's your response to the governor's reasoning behind vetoing the bill? Do you buy that?
I don't. I think it was really flimsy. Lobbyists already have a 48-hour reporting period on expenses during the session. So they're already doing reports over the weekend. They're working just as we are in the legislature, working on Saturdays and Sundays. So it's not onerous if they're already doing it. And the other explanation she gave around, like, we needed more rules and details, I don't think that's for me as a legislator to decide. I think that was up to the Secretary of State to determine those rules, just as that office has determined those rules for expenses and other requirements that are required of lobbyists. So I didn't want to over-legislate because we get called on for doing that. I really wanted the expert, the Secretary of State, to be able to create those rules. And so to offer that excuse and that in her written statement was, I think, really flimsy.
And we spoke during the legislative session before this bill was even passed. In 2022, Open Secrets ranked our state 41st in lobbyist disclosure laws. What do you think that we're losing here now that the bill has been vetoed, as opposed to a reality in which the governor signed this into law?
I think what we're losing is just real transparency in how a bill is shaped and who is behind shaping those bills, especially those of us who live really far away from our capital. So here in Las Cruces, constituents in House District 53 don't have the opportunity to sit in every committee meeting or hear every lobbyist that comes up to testify for a bill. And quite frankly, not every lobbyist will make themselves known or public. And so this bill would have required them to name their statements on every piece of legislation that they're either supporting or working in opposition of. And that would give us more information to decide who's helping shape this bill, who is opposing this bill or in support. And then that gives me as a constituent or a citizen of New Mexico the ability to then figure out how to advocate moving forward. So thinking about medical malpractice, We don't know all the players in that. So how is someone who is struggling to find a doctor able to fully advocate for themselves or their community when it comes to that issue in particular? And so I think we lose a lot of information and power as a constituency.
Do you think that the veto by the governor is indicative of a broader lack of transparency across the state government in New Mexico?
I think lobbyist transparency and even like conflicts of interest for legislators is all part of a wider agenda for modernizing the legislature. When I was up there, one of the things that I realized more and more is the state of New Mexico gets what it pays for. And right now, we're not paying our legislators. And so you're getting part-time pro bono legislation, and it shows. And who gets paid to be in Santa Fe? Lobbyists. And so when we're unclear about who is behind that sort of funding and that influence, it can become very dangerous for democracy, but also for the good that we're trying to do in terms of legislation and laws.
And you mentioned, the modernization of New Mexico's legislature. How do you feel that, everything goes into it, but how do you feel paying the state's legislature would go in terms of changing the balance of power between the executive and with the lobbyists within the state legislature? Would it bring more power to legislators?
I think it would actually bring more power to the districts because you'd have someone working full time for you as a constituent of that district. I am getting calls and emails, and I have a 9-to-5 job. I have bills to pay, and I love legislating. Like the amount of information that I learned, but also the amount of people I've met in the district that I just absolutely am committed to. But also I can't devote my entire time to. I wish I could. And right now I am unable to. And I think, constituents are getting the shortest end of the stick, both with resources, attention, and power and influence.
And I don't think I've heard anyone describe it that way, of bringing power to the districts the way that you say. I think that's a really interesting way to put it. And in one of the columns that I was reading by you in the Albuquerque Journal, you said in light of everything happening in the federal government, now is especially an important time for New Mexico to improve transparency within the state government, going back to the lobbyist bill being vetoed. Can you expand on that thought a bit?
Right. Thanks for reminding me of that, Johnny. I think one of the things that I really wanted to drive home was that our federal government right now, regardless of where we stand on the government, people either love DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, because they are purporting to be more transparent and open. One, that tells me that people that lean more conservative want more transparency and efficiency, and I agree. But even those of us who may be more skeptical of that department and seeing how information is getting hidden, websites are getting stripped of information and research, like the CDC or the Department of Education, and we don't know what's happening with that information. That is also concerning to me. And so all the ways in which transparency work at the federal level, we have to be just as good, if not better, so that we're providing that additional transparency and good governance. Without good governance, we just are at risk of corruption. We're at risk of not making very good laws and being ineffective. And speaking of, the Department of Government Efficiency and the ongoings of the federal government right now, I've done some reporting on some of the protests happening here in Las Cruces. We actually started the show at the top with a report talking about some of these ongoing protests. I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about, folks within Las Cruces gathering and organizing to speak out against this current administration? What are your thoughts on that? I think that's great. That's part of our rights as Americans, as people who live in the United States, our freedom of speech, to be able to protest when we don't like things that our government is doing. And I think as New Mexicans, like I said before, 70% of our babies are born on Medicaid, and there is a threat of stripping that funding, not just from New Mexico, but from states across the country. Here, KRWG, our public radio and TV stations are getting threatened with being completely slashed and removing their federal budgets. That is concerning for those of us who want an informed electorate. And Social Security staff being slashed. If you are on Social Security and you try to call because there's an issue or you have questions, it's going to take you longer or maybe not get through to anyone at all. These things impact New Mexico families, ourselves, and our kids. And if we are not calling that out for what it is, that it's going to slowly deteriorate our community and the quality of life across the state, we have to be resisting that at every level. And I know I'm committed to doing that as a representative and ensuring that people still have access to the resources that our tax dollars have paid for.
And and you touched on this a little bit, but what are you hearing from constituents on the ground about what is happening at the federal government? What are their biggest concerns?
I've got a number of calls around, I've lost 40% of my retirement funds when the Dow lost 6 to 8 points a few weeks ago at the announcement of the tariffs, the tariff rates that were going to go into effect. So people losing their retirement, people afraid of losing their Social Security, and what will happen if they are at risk of losing their checks that they worked hard for. And then the other thing that I've heard are our students with disabilities who need the resources and programming and support from the Department of Education that our school districts receive, but really it's the Department of Education funding and curriculum and support that our students with disabilities just really desperately need, that are at risk of just being deleted and not existing for those families, and that's really scary. And moving a little bit back to the legislative session, we're not even 100 days into this current presidential administration, and I know you were a freshman lawmaker, so this was your first legislative session legislating, but were the ongoing, the ongoing federal government, everything happening at the federal government, did that affect the way you legislate? It affected some of the questions that I had. So I sit on House Appropriations and Finance Committee, and I sit on Taxation and Revenue, so the two big money committees. And I had questions about our state wealth funds, for example. So with the big drop in the stock market with tariffs, and then when we think about Medicaid and how we might fund that if it were to be cut, that's one of our biggest expenditures in our budget. So I was asking questions about what is the plan B if these things were to happen? If the Dow drops more than X amount of points, how much will we lose in our state wealth funds? So we have about 12 wealth funds that we take money from oil and gas and other revenues and we invest it back. So that it builds up over time through investments in the stock market. We have the second largest state wealth funds in the country, and we have the 13th largest funds in the world. And that's been built up over the last decade, 15 years. Incredible work. And I was able to learn that even if the stock market were to drop 20 points, that we would still only be exposed about 6 to 7% of our funds would lose some revenue. So it's not like these giant drops in the stock market will create giant drops in the wealth that we've built over time. And so that was really great to hear. But I wouldn't have asked that if we weren't in this predicament with the federal government.
Right. Well, I want to get back a little bit to state-specific issues and again to some of the bills that the governor vetoed. House Bill 14, we spoke extensively about your support for that. Among other provisions, it would establish an earned income tax credit, introduce certain surtaxes on oil and gas products, even eliminated the gross receipts tax on medical services. There's a lot that went into this bill, but the governor in her written response to why she vetoed the bill, I'll go ahead and read you the quote. This bill was thrown together without adequate dynamic scoring, without consultation with my office, and without any clear strategy for how we grow our economy or provide lasting tax relief. It reflects a fragmented thesis and decision-making drive more by political self-interest than public good. So I just want to give you the platform. What is your response to that?
My response, one, is I thought that the tax bill that the House and the Senate came up with during concurrence was solid. One, because we're at a standstill with medical malpractice and reforming that, the GRT for healthcare related equipment and helping healthcare professionals was so necessary. And it did have an analysis. There was an analysis to that. The same with the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit would have eliminated the state income tax for an additional 100,000 families, and most families of four making less than $70,000 would have seen their tax liability completely eliminated in the state of New Mexico. So places like Chaparral, which I represent, the largest unincorporated community, that whole entire community would have seen almost entirely their tax liability erased through the earned income tax credit. Same with Oregon or Butterfield, Anthony, New Mexico, places like that would have entire communities not have to pay a state income tax. And that is, one, smart legislating, and two, we want to alleviate some of the cost burden for families, because we're going to see bigger costs on housing and food over the next several weeks, other items that we rely on, and this was going to provide immediate relief. Now, so I disagree with the governor that this was not thought out well. I thought it was. And the way that we were going to fund that was to increase the taxes on oil royalties, because right now gas companies and corporations are paying more in taxes in natural gas than they are for oil. And so we wanted to just equalize that. And the Senate took that out. They stripped that out of the tax package. And I thought that was a really smart way to recoup some of the investments and the income that New Mexicans deserve. I think oil corporations have the privilege of extracting oil from New Mexico. That is our oil, that's our resource. And we can tax it at a rate that is reasonable for the corporations, but also gives a solid return for New Mexicans. And we're going to use that to refund and to fund the budget so that people could have the earned income tax credit. Instead, we're here where families don't get relief, and we're still not getting our fair share in those royalties.
And that is something that we did talk extensively about in that interview a few months ago. And something else I did want to ask about was about the lack of doctors in the state. There's a shortage of medical professionals, and with many of those laws not even making it to the governor's desk, including medical malpractice reform and creation of interstate doctor compacts, where should the state go from here to address this particular issue?
Well, one, I think that this was the first time, I'd been listening to this debate as an advocate for the last couple of years, and as someone who needs specialist doctors. I have an autoimmune disease, and so been paying attention to this issue quite closely. And then when I started running for office, it was one of the first things I heard on the doors. So I'd knock on doors and people were like, we need more doctors, we need specialists. Or I'm a doctor and I need to find ways to be able to stay here or hire more doctors. And so I think the first step, one, is elected officials, I think, need to listen to everyone in the debate. So healthcare professionals, hospitals, and yes, trial attorneys and patients. But right now there was this dismissive orientation to doctors and healthcare professionals. And I think people are taking that more seriously now. And, I have to come back to there's a big lobby to keep the status quo on medical malpractice. And so part of my bill was to help, kind of upend the status quo of how we do business. And unfortunately, neither of those bills passed. I was a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 176 that would have reformed medical malpractice. And I'm looking forward to trying again.
The governor was particularly perturbed by what she called inaction from the state legislature regarding public safety, especially after the Young Park shooting here in Las Cruces. How do you feel the legislature handled public safety during this session? And do you feel that the governor has merit in being angered by how the legislative session went down?
Yeah, I think we worked really hard. And we worked really long hours to make sure that we were doing the whole business of New Mexico. And 60 days isn't enough. I think, again, modernizing our legislature is really important. And I will tell you that I worked hard to allocate over $3 million for a public safety facility in Chaparral. So we got $3 million in capital outlay, and then I was able to secure $1 million for that public safety facility in the state budget, and she vetoed it. So if she wants to be serious about public safety, I'd want to see just a more holistic approach and not see her veto public safety dollars in the budget.
And just very briefly, very quickly, thoughts on a special session? Do you think that would be productive at all or not?
I think it's productive when we do the pre-work. I think the interim sessions, which are going to start next month, are going to provide a lot of space and a lot of productive conversations and work. I'm looking forward to people in my district showing up. I'll be inviting folks to show up to those interim meetings, either online or in person. But I think that's a really important place. And I'd rather have a modernized legislature than having special sessions just randomly throughout the year.
Well, Representative Sarah Silva, I really appreciate you coming in to talk with us. It's been an eye-opening interview, and it's always good to have you in the studio rather than via Zoom in Santa Fe. So thanks for coming in and talking with me today.
Yeah, it's good to be home. Thanks.
Of course. And that's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For all of us here at KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Fronteras, A Changing America.